If you've previously watched part 1 of this presentation, you already know what this is all about. Though if you haven't, watch it, assuming it's still on YouTube. That's also assuming that even the internet itself still exists if you're watching this in the distant future. As for the content of part 2, it contains what are essentially the leftovers from assembling part 1. Not only did all of my findings for the previous topics end up spiraling into a much longer presentation than I had originally envisioned, but there were several other topics that either came to mind while I was writing, or which I realized I hadn't covered previously. In effect, there was enough information left on the cutting room floor of what became part 1 that part 2 became necessary. Almost all of the topics and sources needed for part 2 had actually been amassed in an outline for more than a year before this presentation could go into production, but as it turns out, creative endeavors are difficult. I could have just published part 1 before starting to hammer a proper script out of part 2, but I wanted to publish these videos in relatively quick succession, so part 2 had to be ready before part 1 could even be posted. With that out of the way, it's best we jump right into the main presentation, because if you haven't noticed how long this video is, you're going to be here a while. This first section may not be the longest in this presentation, but I ended up rambling and going off on brief tangents quite a bit, even after lots of editing and paring down, so I admit that it may not be easy to follow. However, I can also guarantee you this is also the only skeptical analysis of the subject matter that you are likely to ever see on the internet, so sorry, but not sorry. In 2021, the US Army announced the latest iteration of yet another seasonally occurring effort over the last 30 years, an attempt to develop an M1A3. As is to be expected from such an effort, the new vision for the M1 Abrams will only make it exponentially worse. After all, it's not the first time the Army has attempted to develop an M1A3, and all of the previous efforts have ended in grief. The ones I can think of off the top of my head include the TTB from the mid-1980s, the M1C ATTB from 1987, the M1A1 Block 3 proposal from 1989, the M1 Thumper from the early 1990s, and the quickly abandoned and forgotten 1996 design that was the first to actually be officially dubbed the M1A3. These vehicles all used automatic loaders, and most of them had unmanned turrets, which the Army ultimately determined weren't worth the effort. So naturally, the new M1A3 Abrams under development now has an unmanned turret and an automatic loader. It's obvious that the reason why the US Army wants an unmanned turret and an automatic loader now is only because the Russians are doing it and have upstaged the US Army in the press as a result. Yet nothing but the sound of crickets from the Army regarding the fact that the T-14 Armata is powered by a diesel V12 engine instead of a gas turbine. But I digress. The accidental implication of which is that the US government should adopt communism so that we can compete more effectively. The Army is now framing the concept of a tank with an autoloader and an unmanned turret as a novel concept to arms development, as though the failed AMX-ELC of the 1950s, HSTVL of the 1970s, and SGRV 2000 of the 1980s somehow never existed. It's also absolutely astounding that the US Army could have made so terrible a conceptual error when their own decades-long narrative on tank design fully disqualifies these concepts. That outfitting the M1 Abrams with an autoloader and an unmanned turret are grievous conceptual errors on the Army's part is exposed by their own published literature. You may recall from another series of presentations I have created, Failed Tanks, that episode 35 featured a vehicle known as the Future Main Battle Tank, or FMBT for short. The FMBT was designed by Asher Shironi and Lawrence Bacon, whom you will remember from previous presentations of the Western Design Corporation. It boasted an unmanned turret and automatic loader, and the US Army Armor School's official publication, Armor Magazine, featured concept art of the design on the cover of their July through August 1993 issue. It goes without saying that the Army was clearly publicizing the FMBT as a feeler to gauge the reaction to the notion of a tank with an autoloader and unmanned turret, a concept they had been wringing their hands over for some time by then. The staff of Armor magazine heaped praise upon the FMBT, but would soon come to regret that decision. Cheroni and Bacon unwittingly created what was soon after to be recognized throughout the armor community as a perfect model of how a tank should never be built. Letters and articles from tankers and actual tank design experts flooded in to Armor magazine and were published, which chimed in on the FMBT and unmanned turrets. Their response was simply damning. Of particular note among these experts was Don Lowlin, who had been a US Marine armor officer before a 35-year career as an ordnance engineer, all preceding the dates in which he first sent letters and articles to Armor magazine. Don Lowlin was a frequent thorn in the side of the DoD and defense industry for several decades. In the 1970s, he wrote to the Government Accountability Office concerning the Pentagon's then ongoing case-telescoped ammunition program, which convinced the GAO, and ultimately Congress as well, that this program should be terminated. Lowlin also became a vociferous critic of the interim armored vehicle program in the early 2000s, and his findings foresaged the disaster that the resulting Stryker was to become. Despite Lowlin's reputation as a maverick, not a single attempt was ever made by anyone in the defense community to refute any of his statements. That said, it was noted in the replies to Armor magazine's tank design contest results that due to the limited pivot of the autoloader and the low design of the FMBT, it had less gun elevation than most other Western tanks, and so little gun depression, that it was practically unusable on all but the flattest terrain. Removing the crew from the turret inevitably bred the compulsion to remove armor from the turret, as the crew are no longer inside of it, making the structure on tanks that is most likely to be hit by enemy fire more vulnerable to penetration. Removing the crew from the turret also eliminated unrestricted top vision, as it was no longer possible for the TC to stand up through a cupola on the roof and survey the battlefield with his own eyes. The FMBT was instead to use a variety of sensor windows and camera arrays, which are vulnerable to being obscured by mud, dust, ash, and a wide range of other detritus typical of a battlefield. To say nothing of these cameras and sensors easily being damaged or destroyed by small arms fire, shell fragmentation, shrapnel, falling debris, and many similar hazards that can be expected to pepper tanks that are exchanging fire with the enemy. The main gun ammunition was moved into a rotating carousel in the hull, in the same configuration as the Soviet-made T-72, which, as you may recall, exploded so violently when penetrated, as a direct consequence of this configuration, that their 25-ton turrets were yeeted 40 feet into the air. As the carousel also sat directly atop the belly plate, a shaped charge anti-tank mine could be expected to detonate the FMBT like a giant pipe bomb, and the same for a direct hit on the turret by a top attack munition. Another fatal error of the FMBT's design was that, by removing the fighting compartment from the turret and its basket, the only place for the crew was sitting abreast in the front of the vehicle. Not only does this place the crew in the most likely part of the hull to be penetrated by casualty-type anti-tank mines, but a heat or sabot penetration through the side of the forward hull will bifurcate the entire crew. As you can see in cutaway views of the M1, its turret basket alone is too cramped to accommodate the crew, and it goes without saying that personnel will not be expected to inhabit its blast furnace-like engine compartment. That makes it too obvious that an M1 with an unmanned turret will inevitably have 2 or 3 crew members sitting in the front of the hull, exactly where they would have been inside the FMBT. Also exactly where the crew are placed inside the T-14 Armata, which the Pentagon and their mouthpieces low-key worship, and are now portraying as a dire threat in an attempt to keep their budget fat and happy. Yet another issue that no one in the US defense industry or military seems to have the moral courage to address is the fact that with a crew buried deep into the front of the hull, the interior of the turret will only be accessible by exiting the vehicle. From there, a crewman exiting the vehicle must climb onto the roof and open a hatch, continuously exposed along the way to all of the threats that are the reason the M1 Abrams encases its crew in armor. If any of the weapons malfunction, a fire starts inside the turret that the suppression system can't handle, the machine gun must be reloaded with a new belt, or the autoloader or the replenisher breaks down. This is exactly what one of the crewmen must do. It's either that, or return to base, and if the vehicle does so in the middle of a battle, it has thus suffered what military terminology refers to as a firepower kill. The obvious solution to these problems is to remove the autoloader and replenish a middleman entirely, move everyone but the driver out of the driver's compartment and into the turret, thicken the turret armor, load the weapons manually, add a cupola to the roof to restore top vision, and get rid of all the cameras that the cupola has rendered completely redundant. But then you'll just have a regular tank again, and the sales and ongoing technical support for a simple and reliable weapon aren't as profitable to the defense industry as a gold-plated Rube Goldberg machine that's always stuck in maintenance. Moreover, I will not only remind you that the FMBT was both initially publicized and subsequently thoroughly discredited in the Army's own publications during the 1990s, but also that as of 2021, the Army has already operated a vehicle with an unmanned turret. Namely, the M1128 Striker mobile gun system, which has become such a complete cluster truck that the Army forced them all into retirement last year. Only 150 examples of the Striker MGS were built, and now they're on their way to the scrap heap after less than 2 decades of service. It shouldn't have been a surprise to the Army, because the so-called low-profile turret used on the Striker MGS, which is neither low-profile nor technically even a turret, was part of a previous offering to the Army. That was the Teledyne Expeditionary Tank, which had been first offered to the US Army all the way back in the early 1980s as a competing design for the Armored Gun System program, which was intended to yield a replacement for the M551 Sheridan Airborne Light Tank. The selling point of the low-profile turret was in part that being unmanned helped keep the expeditionary tank's height low, but it ended up being significantly taller than the other 2 finalists. The 2 other finalists in question were the Cadillac Gauge Commando Stingray and the United Defense CCVL, which both had manned turrets. The expeditionary tank also had a lot of trouble cycling ammunition and suffered frequent autoloader and replenisher malfunctions, an imbroglio which replayed itself all over again during the development of the Striker MGS. Clearing these stoppages, of course, required someone to climb up atop the hull and then enter the turret from above, as the crew compartment far forward in the hull made it inaccessible from below. Why does that sound familiar? This was not an issue with the CCVL, whose turret was manned. The autoloader and replenisher were both easily cycled manually by the crew simply by flipping open the top access cover. Crew injury while manually cycling the autoloader was effectively impossible, as simply opening the access cover also disconnected the mechanisms that operated it. Not that it was ever necessary, because the CCVL's autoloader was lifted right out of the proven 5-inch Mark 45 turret that had been used by the US Navy for decades by this time, and was so reliable that despite cycling thousands of rounds throughout development and testing, the CCVL's autoloader and replenisher never suffered a single malfunction. The Commando Stingray never suffered a single autoloader or replenisher malfunction either, because it never had them. Its manned turret included a human loader. The excessive height of the expeditionary tank was the final straw for the Army, and it was the first of the 3 finalists to be eliminated, as a taller vehicle is a more dangerous payload to airdrop from a C-130 Hercules. The Commando Stingray was also only narrowly rejected by the US Army, but Thailand ended up buying 105 of them, which are still in service to this day. The CCVL was declared the winner, and was type classified as the XM8, later as the M8 Buford. Meanwhile, despite a long and desperate marketing effort by Teledyne, they never sold any expeditionary tanks, and marketing for it ceased in the late 1990s. The unmanned low-profile turret was later offered on a wide range of other vehicle hulls, including those from the es.It, M60 Patton, Centurion, Challenger, and LAV-1, but not a single military in all the world was stupid enough to buy it. Not a single military, except the US Army, who bought it as a component of the M1128 Striker mobile gun system. How quickly they unlearned their own recent history. General Dynamics, who also built the Striker, and who bought out Teledyne in the 1990s, continued aggressive marketing of the low-profile turret and the Striker MGS, and with considerable assistance from a US Army eager to grow their sunk cost into the Striker as fast as possible, ultimately ensnared Canada into a Striker MGS order of their own. After all, given that the Striker is constructed entirely in the General Dynamics factory in London, Ontario for export to the US, Canada already had them in production. Incidentally, this makes the US Army's acquisition of the Striker a violation of US law, specifically the Berry Amendment, which mandates that the US military use only American-made products assembled from American-made materials. But I digress. However, with the Canadian purchase for the Striker MGS still on hiatus in the mid-2000s, the Canadian Army brought the Leopard C2 main battle tanks the Striker MGS was to replace out of retirement for use in Afghanistan. The Leopard C2 went on to achieve phenomenal combat success in Afghanistan, and as the Canadian Army witnessed the disastrous ongoing development and combat showings of the Striker MGS, they cancelled the entire MGS order. All of the money Canada set aside for the Striker MGS was instead spent on buying surplus Leopard 2 main battle tanks from Germany. The Leopard 2 has a manned turret, by the way. And now, in the wake of the embarrassments that were the expeditionary tank, the FMBT, the Striker MGS, the FCS, the MGV, the GCV, and the OMFV, the Army is now once again committed to an armored vehicle with an unmanned turret. It's not that they don't learn, but that they just don't care how badly they compromise national security and the safety of their subordinates. Also, remember from earlier how much of the US Army's preventative maintenance budget the M1 Abrams consumes? Experience has proven an autoloader will make it far worse. It was noted in the March through April 1989 Armor magazine issue, in a story about the Centauro recon vehicle titled The Return of the Gun Tank Destroyer, that the Italian Army had rejected an autoloader for use in the Centauro, as it created too much cost and complexity. US Army First Lieutenant Todd R. Brannan also had a few additional insights in the letters section of the July to August 1995 issue of Armor magazine as to why adopting an automatic loader is a fool's errand for a main battle tank. The following are excerpts from Lieutenant Brannan's letter.
A tank crew is a team and every man is essential to the success of a mission. Automation of the main gun will not reduce the workload of a tank crew or platoon. What an autoloader will do is take up precious space, require maintenance, and almost certainly reduce the number of troops available to accomplish the mission. Sharoney and Bacon state that the 3 versus 4 man crew is a doctrinal issue and should not be driven by engineering considerations. Having said that, they move right on to bend doctrine to fit an autoloader design. Here are some doctrinal issues from a line unit. 1. Keep it simple. 2. Tank crews cannot afford to be any smaller. There is too much soldering to be done. 3. Tank designs that sport unmanned turrets are no-go. The tanker's greatest asset is his commanding first-person view of the battlefield. The crew needs to be up in the turret, oriented with the weapons. Fighting a tank from the hull like a mole may increase survivability, but strips the crew of its natural situation awareness and ability to fight the tank. WDC decrees that automatic loading systems will become standard. Crew member duties will be readjusted to address other battlefield management and technological needs. Wow, sounds great. Perhaps they can explain how to readjust the tasks required to prepare a defensive position. I'll be all for an autoloader when it can replace the M8 chemical alarm.
In short, the Army has known for a long time that the changes they are now planning for the M1 Abrams are cursed. Given that the M1A3 changes far too much and weighs far too wrong, it is likely the final nail in the coffin for the development of the M1 Abrams FOV. If that sounds far-fetched to you, then know that this outcome has become a trend in the US Army. Recall from the 2021 Bradley update that the Army themselves have publicly stated that the failure and termination of the A5 Bradley program prompted them to cease all further development on the Bradley fighting vehicle. However, the M1A3 isn't the only new tank program the US Army is currently pursuing. And no, I'm not talking about the Griffin 3, although I might have to address that topic in another presentation in the future. Though before we jump into that, I'd like to note that there might be a lot of overlap between the first and second segments of this video, as they both involve numerous poor tank design decisions that are common to both topics. As such, many of the sources in the video description for this topic also apply to the next one. This is going to be another long one, so we'd better get started now. Like clockwork, the US Army is once again floating a narrative about an M1 Abrams replacement, citing recent developments in tank design abroad. In other words, the Pentagon is reacting to events in weapon development, rather than controlling them, the same self-destructive and hopelessly predictable behavior patterns they display in the way they fight their wars. This is a recurring behavior of the Army, dating back nearly 30 years. While almost all of the Army's previous tanks already had their successor in development by the time they entered service, the Army's efforts, since the M1 Abrams was declared operational in 1980, have been talking rather than working. The development and production of the es.It, Macleod, Arjun, Type 90, Black Eagle, K1, Type 96, Challenger 2, T-14 armor tub, and other main battle tanks have all come and gone since the M1 Abrams entered service, and the Army are so completely sold on their own lies about the M1's merits that they've checked out of the tank business altogether. There are a number of press articles on the M1 replacement effort, but the most instructive is the one titled "Life After Abrams. If it doesn't look or act like a tank, it still may be the tank of the future." This is because the article in question was published not by some random news outlet, but by the Association of the United States Army, or AUSA, itself. A self-evident front for the US Army, the AUSA is an astroturf organization that merely floats whatever narrative the Army tells them to, the way the Army tells them to. This makes the AUSA a window into what the Army is thinking and doing. After you've read all of the brain-melting word salad of meaningless buzzwords, acronyms, gimmickry, and obvious pretenses of deconstructing the very concept of the tank in this AUSA article, it immediately becomes obvious what's really happening here. Namely, the US Army has no idea what the hell they are even trying to do, and they are trying to use big words to conceal their impotence. This is what is referred to as obfuscation. The prerequisite talents, knowledge, and skills for developing a new armored fighting vehicle are perishable, and the Army hasn't developed a genuinely original main battle tank design for more than 40 years. If you look at the concept sketches that have been published by, or leaked from the Army, and by leaked, I mean planted, it's clear that they are just rehashing old ideas. And worse still, they're all only ideas that never worked, and self-evidently never will. The Army's best attempts to conceive of a completely new approach to designing distant future armored fighting vehicles have resulted in official concept art that look like they came from the cutting room floor of a cancelled Killzone game project. But more importantly, the radical new thinking of the Army in the late 2010s has resulted in sketches of what are evidently the Komatsu Type 87 ARV from the 1980s, the Raybeck Badger all-terrain vehicle of the early 2000s, the VBC-90 recon vehicle from the 1990s outfitted with wheel versions of the failed aerial propulsion system project that ended in ignominious failure in the 1960s, and the failed LAV-105 that the US Marines rejected in the early 1990s. How many committees did these sketches go through that failed to notice that their tanks of the future are all armored cars of the past? No new ideas. No future. This also isn't the first time the Army has succumbed to the siren song of wheeled armor, as the disastrous Kevlar coffin has shown us, and the idea of replacing tracked armor with trucks is presented unironically, as though it isn't a proposal to emulate Belgium. Canada nearly fell into the same trap as well in the early 2000s, which we've already seen. The prospects for the M1 Abrams replacement effort are dark indeed, because the aforementioned issues not only prove it to be irreparably doomed by the simple fact that no one the Army involves themselves with either knows or cares what a tank is supposed to be, but more likely than not, they won't even be able to build it at all. Colonel John Boyd once commented of several doomed US Air Force programs that they are out of airspeed, altitude, and ideas. Although the saying is a reference to aviation, it still otherwise perfectly fits the Army's latest crisis of competence. There is one certainty, however, given past US Army tank design trends, the next tank will be significantly heavier than the last one. In short tons, the US Army went from the 30-ton M4 Sherman, to the 45-ton M26 Pershing, to the 50-ton M48 Patton, to the 52-ton M60 Patton, to the 60-ton M103, and MBT-70, to the 62-ton M1 Abrams, to the 70-ton M1 Abrams, to the 72-ton M1A2 es.It Abrams, to the 85-ton M1A2C Abrams. Given that the last couple of M1 Abrams variants have grown in leaps and bounds to 85 tons, the latest variant of the originally 25-ton Bradley fighting vehicle now weighs 50 tons, and that the GCV intended until recently to replace the Bradley was to weigh 85 tons, it isn't much of a stretch to assume the replacement for the M1 Abrams will weigh at least 90 tons, if not more than 100 tons. The Army will of course defend this indefensible decision, as they make preparations to field the spiritual successor to Germany's Maus tank. This of course sounds ridiculous, but would any of you have predicted 15 years ago that the Army would present to the world an 85-ton main battle tank with a straight face? This is what psychologists refer to as the Ratchet effect, and when combined with incestuous amplification, the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, and placed inside of an echo chamber, the results tend to be tragicomic. Like, for example, the 85-ton main battle tank the Army is now fielding. A related article on military.com titled, "Army Studying Whether M1 Tank Replacement Should Be Driver Optional," reads like a cautionary tale of why you can't trust the system. For instance, let's just recite the title of that article once more. Army Studying Whether M1 Tank Replacement Should Be Driver Optional. We already know better from the disastrous combat results of Russia's Uran-9 unmanned ground vehicle in Syria than to ever again rely on a computer to control and navigate an armored fighting vehicle. Yet more than a year after the uproar in the international press over that imbroglio, we still see the Army trying to crawl into that roach motel. This is only just the title of the article. The Army's own statements, uttered by Brigadier General Richard Kaufman, the director of the NGCV program, are even more vacuous. If you remember the NGCV program from the 2021 update on the Bradley fighting vehicle, you already know this will be a complete shit show. For instance, Russia is no longer described as a peer adversary, only a near-peer adversary. Spoiler alert, when another country has literally thousands more operational nuclear warheads than you do, they aren't a near-peer adversary. Of course, the Russians also made the hilariously bad Uran-9, but I digress. General Kaufman states first that the proposals will describe what Increment 1 will look like for our soldiers, but then states, in his own words, that we are really looking forward to seeing what industry delivers. In other words, the industry is running the show, while the Army somehow still thinks they're the ones in charge. Asked what features the M1's replacement will have, Kaufman admits that the Army still doesn't even have a design for the vehicle yet. 4 decades after the M1 Abrams entered service, and the Army is still doing design studies. 40 years later, and still no vision for a successor. The wheels of bureaucracy are slow to turn, but this is ridiculous. General Kaufman states that the program officials are making an effort to maintain protection without adding too much weight. Again, see the 2021 Bradley update video on the US Army's attempts to develop later generations of, and replacements for, the Bradley fighting vehicle to get an idea of how the Army's attempt at minimizing the weight of the M1 successor will end up. I still maintain that the M1 replacement will weigh at least 90 short tons. But back to the article. Kaufman goes on to say the following on the successor tank's armament, and in this case I will quote him directly.
Will that be a 120mm or make it up? Will that be a 175mm? I don't know, but everything is on the table and we owe our Army an assessment on what is possible.
Translated into plain speech, General Kaufman is stating that the army still doesn't know what kind of gun they want on their next tank. Again, 40 years after the M1 Abrams went into service. Worse still, that statement has the obvious implication that the army are seriously entertaining a larger bore gun than the M256. This would mean developing a completely new and exorbitantly expensive range of ammunition, with no guarantee that any US allies will adopt weapons chambered in that round either. The army would much prefer that you forgot how many decades it took to standardize 105mm ammunition across NATO, only to put a last-minute bait and switch that forced everyone to adopt smoothbore 120mm ammunition, just as 105mm rounds were becoming normalized. For a cautionary tale of how badly tank gun hypertrophy can turn out, consider the British decision to arm their chieftain tank with the rifled 120mm L11 gun in the late 1960s, and their expectation that the rest of NATO would fall in line and switch to equivalent guns and compatible ammunition, just because all of them were already in the process of doing the same with Britain's preceding 105mm L7. The rest of NATO stuck with 105mm guns through the 1970s, with most member states not upgunning to a larger weapon until the 1990s. Britain ended up being the only NATO member ever to use the L11 and its ammunition, as well as the succeeding L30, only for all of these to ultimately give way completely to 120mm smoothbore guns anyway on the new Challenger 3. Back to the smoothbore 120mm gun. Not only were all of its ammunition several times as expensive as their 105mm counterparts, but the M1A1 ended up carrying only 2/3 as much ammunition as the preceding M1 and IPM1. While a field supply train for a tank battalion only held half as much 120mm ammunition in total, compared to one carrying 105mm rounds. 120mm rounds are also much heavier than 105mm rounds as well, placing greater strain on both human and mechanical loaders, leading to more rapid fatigue for human loaders, and more rapid wear for auto loaders. 120mm ammunition is also already approaching the practical limit for what a human can seriously be expected to lift, as the French Navy learned the hard way with the 130mm and 138mm guns on their interwar era destroyers. The Army's mad dash to regun the M1 Abrams with a 120mm gun also proved pointless, as the successful use of 105mm guns against T-72s in Lebanon during the 1980s, then Kuwait, Iraq, and Yemen in the 1990s has proven. In fact, after the 1980 to Lebanon War, captured Israeli 105mm APFSDS ammunition was given to the Soviet Union for testing and evaluation, and gave the Russians some nasty surprises. Dubbed the M111 heads, the Soviet army fired this APFSDS round from a captured Maguk 4 main battle tank at the latest T-72B1 variant at the Kubinka Proving Grounds later in 1982, and they were horrified to discover that it went right through the strongest armor. The M111 Hetz was also grossly inferior in armor penetration to the US Army's 105mm M900 APFSDS round fielded in 1989. A fact the system rug swept to protect the continuing acquisition and use of the M256. Despite this, and despite tank armor evolution having effectively peaked in the early 1980s, the Army is still seriously entertaining the possibility of the M1 successor having a 140mm gun, a proposal akin to selecting a sledgehammer to swat a fly. Not only would a gun this large present crippling problems with ammunition handling, recoil, and a substantially greater muzzle blast danger zone for surrounding personnel when firing the gun, but it also means far less ammunition can be carried. Ammo stowage would be reduced down to at most 30 rounds, and an extremely long ammunition compartment would be required, given that the shell casing alone for the 140mm round is a whopping 1 meter long, and the number of rounds a field supply train with a fixed storage volume can transport will be cut in half once more. That also means that the field supply trains already dangerously overworked with the maintenance and refueling of M1s will also have to bring them ammunition more often as well. Carrying less ammunition than your enemies is a quick way to shoot yourself in the foot, as the Arabs learned the hard way. The following is noted on page 38 of the book M60 vs G62, Cold War Combatants 1956 through 92 by Simon Dunstan.
The amount of gun rounds inside the Patton M60A1, M60, M48, and the Centurion tanks is remarkably higher. About 60 rounds in each. Than in the T62 and T55 tanks. Less than 40 rounds. The meaning is that on average the T62 and T55 tanks should leave their active fight and firing positions for refilling of gun ammunition more often than the other tanks, which means that on average the percentage of effective tanks in each moment is smaller in T62 and T55 units than in the units of the other tank types.
In other words, by pursuing an ever larger gun attached to an ever larger tank, the Army is self-evidently moving in the exact opposite direction that past experience has shown to be the correct decision. Though more recently, the Army has finally officially named the program for the M1 Abrams replacement, and it is now referred to as the OMT, shorthand for Optionally Manned Tank. Look back upon the OMFV and NGCV programs previously outlined in the 2021 Bradley Update video for a glimpse of the inevitable fate of the OMT. Moreover, as the fiasco that the unmanned Uran 9 has proven in Syria, an empty tank is an empty threat. The three finalists of the OMT program have also outed how much of an imagination wasteland the Army has become, as version 1 is a clone of the T-14 Armata, version 2 is an NKPZ suffering from a terminal case of gigantism, and version 3 is a Star Trek transporter beam accident that merged a Leclerc with a GCV. Moreover, the Army would much prefer you didn't know that all of these new ideas are not only old, but also thoroughly discredited by their own past publications. For example, recall the FMBT described earlier in this video, and the armor community's backlash against it. Moreover, recall that the FMBT was designed by Asher Shironi and Lawrence Bacon of Western Design Howden, a company previously named the Western Design Company, or WDC. If you look up Western Design Company today on the internet, you will see that all they've ever manufactured were spare parts, which needless to say, is a huge red flag on the part of their resident celebrity tank designers. That said, the remaining segments of this presentation are all basically random topics that I've never covered in detail before, but at the same time, aren't significant enough to warrant their own chapters of the real M1 Abrams. A few of these were originally destined for another fun M1 Abrams facts video which ultimately never went into production. Also, speaking of things that were never produced. One of the most widespread disagreements between most publications on the M1 Abrams concerns the number that were produced, and it seems that, if you look at any three of them, all three will present a different number from one another. Wikipedia claims some 10,396 were built, while FAS, the Federation of American Scientists, claims some 8,800 were built. Tanks Encyclopedia claims 9,000 were built. Degel, or however you're supposed to pronounce it, claims 10,646 were built, and I recall that at least one source claimed 12,000 were built. I've previously gone with the figure presented by FAS, not only because they are historically an extremely reliable source, but also because their M1 Abrams page was last updated in year 2000, and notes that the final deliveries of new M1 chassis were then taking place. That the last production M1A2s had already been delivered by that time was confirmed by Tanks and Combat Vehicles Recognition Guide, written by Christopher F. Foss, and published by Janes, and this book was also published in 2000. However, the figure provided by FAS, while correct, is also wrong. Allow me to elaborate. The production figures for all M1s built prior to the M1A2 are outlined in the American Fighting Vehicle Database's M1 Abrams page. For the original M1, which I shall refer to from here on as the M1A0 to avoid confusion, the IPM1, and the M1A1. The first of these were, quite obviously, the OG M1A0 Abrams. Deliveries ran from 1980 to 1984, with exactly 2,374 built, which were only ever used by the US Army. Also note that the US Army phased out every single M1A0 in their inventory by 1996, and since then no M1A0 has seen operational service. This detail will be important later. If only the taxpayers in 1980 knew the tanks being bought with their money would be out of service in less than 2 decades. The next variant was the improved product M1, or IPM1, which is essentially an M1A1 with a 105mm gun. Built as a stopgap for the M1A1, while the assembly line was being prepared to produce that vehicle, the IPM1 was built in only 1984 and 1985, with a mere 893 vehicles produced. The IPM1 was phased out alongside the M1A0 incidentally, and since then neither model has returned to service. The M1A1 was the most numerous Abrams tank built, with the first deliveries made in 1985, the last in 1993, and a total of 5,572 chassis built. Adding these figures up, that amounts to 8,839 hulls, almost exactly the figure that FAS provided, and the reason why I stated their figure is correct. However, now you will see why that figure is also incorrect. The FAS figure only accounts for US-built M1s, and only pre-M1A2 variants. In addition to the production figures from the American Fighting Vehicle Database's M1 Abrams page, there were also an additional 1,000 M1A1s partly manufactured in Egypt, which are the only M1s ever built outside the US. That brings us to 9,893 chassis, but it still doesn't include the production for the M1A2. Christopher F. Foss noted that M1A2 Abrams production during the 1990s consisted only of 77 examples delivered to the US Army, 315 for Saudi Arabia, and 218 for Kuwait. That means a total of 610 M1A2s were produced, and when added to the aforementioned total, that means 10,503 M1s of all types were produced. This is the genuine number of M1 chassis ever constructed, and while close to the figures presented by Wikipedia and Edgel, both of their figures are off by over 100 chassis, and in 2 different directions. However, also note the existence of the M1A2 SEP, the M104 Wolverine, and the M1 ABV, and that there are literally thousands of them in total. Most of you will find that surprising, but it shouldn't be. And that while it seems to contradict the figure of 10,503 given by multiple combined published sources, it doesn't. As it happens, the Pentagon made no secret that all of their M1s built from year 2000 onward were to be rebuilds of earlier M1s, not fresh new hulls and turrets. Most writers and reporters are simply too lazy to mention that fact, and as a result, a mosaic of multiple sources had to be assembled here, just to create an accurate accounting of the actual number of M1s built. If one reads the published documentation associated with these M1 variants, such as the M1A2 SEP, the M104 Wolverine, and the M1 ABV, it is noted that not a single one of these vehicles is a new built chassis. Rather, every single one of them was a rebuild of an existing older hull taken out of storage. That, of course, raises 2 obvious questions. What M1 hulls were all of the post-2000 M1 Abrams variants converted from, and how old are they? It might seem pointless to count the number of M1 Abrams tanks in existence, but doing so brings to the surface an unpleasant fact about the M1 FOV that the Pentagon was hoping no one would notice. Namely, how old and badly worn out all of the supposedly new SEP series M1A2s are. As noted by Army Guide, the final M1A1 rolled off the assembly line in 1993, by which time M1A2 production had begun, and we have already established that all post-1990s M1 Abrams variants are rebuilds of older tanks. In short, we can confirm that every single supposedly new tank delivered to the US military after the aforementioned 77 M1A2s were converted from vehicles built during or before 1993. That is, the fabulous new M1A2 SEP introduced in the early 2000s began their service lives at the ripe old age of 10 years old or more. But just how old? This is where the number of each previous M1 variant built, and when they were built, comes into play. First, let's consider the M1A1, as it was the most numerous M1 version built, and because new built vehicles were produced for only two nations, the US and Egypt. According to the IISS publication titled Military Balance 2017, the Egyptian army owns 1,360 M1A1s, the last 360 of which were later imported from the US after year 2000. The task and purpose article we saw before noted that at the time it was written, there were 5,200 M1A1s in the US inventory, including some 3,000 that were in disuse. We know that besides the current US-owned M1A1s, 360 were later sold to Egypt, 59 to Australia, 140 to Iraq, and 222 to Morocco, for a total of 781 exported second-hand M1A1s. Combined with 5,572 M1A1s still in the US, and the 1,000 owned by Egypt, that amounts to 6,981 M1A1s built. That leaves only a single possibility, at least 2,228 M1A2 SEPs were converted from the M1A0. I already hear you shouting from the rooftops that it's impossible for 6,981 M1A1s to exist if only 6,572 were built. However, recall that the IPM-1 was just an M1A1 with a 105mm gun, and that these have been retired since 1996. Hundreds of these were rebuilt as M1A1s and returned to service in later years, which explains the discrepancy of 409 extra tanks. Aside from a handful of IPM-1s that became gate guards, all the rest were remanufactured into M1A2 SEPs during the 2000s, but this alone doesn't explain the sheer number of SEPs in existence today. According to Military Balance 2021, published that year by IISS, there were 1,605 M1A2 SEP V2s in service, plus 3,700 M1A1s and M1A2s in storage. This publication doesn't specify exactly how many M1A2s are in storage, but given that task and purpose noted that 3,000 M1A1s were in storage, the number of M1A2s in storage must be approximately 700 tanks. That leaves 2,305 M1A2 SEPs in the US military. I'm going to assume that the 77 original M1A2s weren't upgraded to SEP standard, but that still leaves another 2,228 tanks. It's impossible for the rest of the M1A2 SEPs to have all been converted from IPM-1s, as about 400 instead were converted into M1A1s. Moreover, even if all of the IPM-1s became M1A2s, there were still less than 900 IPM-1s ever built, and at least 2,228 M1A2 SEPs that were converted from other tanks. The fact that hundreds more M1A1s presently exist than were ever new built to that configuration makes it pretty obvious that the M1A2 SEPs couldn't have been converted from these vehicles either. That leaves only a single possibility, at least 2,228 M1A2 SEPs were converted from the M1A0. It's the only explanation that makes sense, as 2,374 M1A0s were built, and 2,228 M1A2 SEPs were converted from tanks that couldn't have been M1A1s or IPM-1s. Recall that the last M1A0s were built in 1984. In other words, of the thousands of M1A2s currently in service today, less than a quarter were built new, and all of those were produced way back in the 1990s. One thing the Army never explicitly states outright, however, is that most of these hulls are at least 38 years old. Given that the number of M1A2 SEPs that couldn't have been converted from IPM-1s or M1A2s numbers over 2,200 hulls, and 2,374 M1A0s were built, some of the M1A2 SEP hulls are in fact a shocking 42 years old. It's also interesting to contrast this with the M60A3 pattern, new built examples of which were manufactured for the US Army from 1978 to 1987. Longer and later than even the M1A0. But of course, the US Army would never upgrade M60A3s made in 1987. because they are too old, so instead they'll upgrade M1s made before 1985, because they are much newer. Let's all just forget the fact that 1,686 M60A3s were built new from scratch for the US Army, and that the oldest of these were only 2 years older than the first M1A0s delivered to the US Army in 1980. In addition to 3,714 older M60A1s and M60A2s remanufactured to A3 standard. After all, it's not like China has 8,000 tanks, or that the US has 800 foreign military bases in more than 40 nations to protect. Moreover, there's yet another dirty little secret concerning the production of the M1 Abrams. Not only did no new build production of the M1 Abrams FOV take place since the mid-1990s, but no new ones can ever be built either, even if the US government or GDLS wanted them. As noted in the 2021 update on the Bradley fighting vehicle, when production of war materials is finally terminated in the US, all factory equipment required to produce the complete weapon system in question is destroyed, in compliance with US law and international arms proliferation treaties. Only a fraction of the assembly line can legally be preserved, and then only for the purpose of refurbishing existing weapons, or producing certain specific parts for them. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Sterling Heights, Michigan, that manufactured all of the M1 Abrams hulls was closed in 1996, and all manufacturing efforts were moved to the Lima Army tank plant located in Lima, Ohio. However, as noted by the press releases, the Lima Army tank plant was only outfitted to build spare parts for tanks, not new hulls or turrets. That also puts into the proper perspective the hype in the early 2000s over the US Army supposedly not wanting any new tanks, GDLS supposedly still having the ability to build new M1A2s, and this supposedly being critical to the national interest. Given what we've previously established, this supposed crisis is obviously just the military-industrial congressional complex playing good cop bad cop as usual, to divert attention away from the fact that no more M1s can ever be built. Such are the extremes to which the system lies to us, in order to protect their precious nest eggs. They are so dishonest about how many M1s exist, and how old they are, that one has to pick through dozens of different publications to find the correct figures. However, it's not just the numbers they're hoping won't be noticed about the M1A2 SEP. It turns out there are some showstoppers involving the M1A2 SEP that somehow escaped my attention, which I discovered when browsing DOT&E's annual report from year 2000. For example, firing the M1A2 SEP's main gun while using thermal imaging causes a washout effect in the display for several seconds, during which the TC and gunner are blind. So much for the supposed speed of the M1A2's vaunted hunter-killer capability. The report claims the washout effect was finally fixed in year 2000. It's a good thing there wasn't a war between then and 1992, when the M1A2 first entered service. Another issue is that the UAPU, the much advertised Under Armour auxiliary power unit, the M1A2 SEP, didn't work, and as such, it was never installed. Instead of a lengthy elaboration, I'll just read to you what DOT&E reported on the matter in their own words.
The development of the Under Armour Auxiliary Power Unit, UAPU, has proven to be a significant program challenge. The UAPU is intended to provide auxiliary electrical and hydraulic power to the system during the conduct of mounted surveillance, thus reducing engine usage during tactical operations while improving operational fuel consumption rates. Engineering design problems encountered during developmental testing with the UAPU have led the program to delete the UAPU from the M1A2 SEP production configuration. The UAPU remains an important system requirement, however the program is not currently funded to continue UAPU development and the UAPU is not currently included in the production configuration of the system.
You will recall from earlier that ultimately, the UAPU ended up replacing one of the 4 fuel cells in the M1A2 SEP, only to be removed later. Yet the removed fuel cells were never reinstalled, and were instead replaced by an over-glorified car battery. Another example of how badly the Army botched the M1A2's development is that it inexplicably acquired a problem with uncommanded gun movements that no prior M1s had an issue with. Somehow previously overlooking this astonishing failure, I had to shoehorn in this topic at the last minute while creating this video because it's too damn funny to leave on the cutting room floor. The M1A2's tendency to suddenly move its gun without warning plagued it for years, setting back its service entry for half a decade. I'll just let the DOT&E document's own text speak for itself.
The M1A2 IOT&E was conducted from September to December 1993. Based on the results of the IOT&E, the director determined that the M1A2 was operationally effective, but not operationally suitable, and unsafe. That assessment was based on poor availability and reliability of the tank, and instances of the uncommanded main gun and turret movement. FOT&E1 was conducted September to October 1995 to verify corrective actions resulting from the IOT&E. This test was halted due to continued instances of uncommanded main gun and turret movements. FOT&E2 in June 1996 confirmed the adequacy of the applied corrective actions, and the M1A2 was assessed as both operationally effective and suitable.
Contrast these behind-the-scenes hijinks with the US Army's party line that the M1A2 Abrams became operational in 1992 after its production began in 1986. In other words, they've been caught in yet another lie. Finally, note the year that the M1A2's uncommanded gun movement problem wasn't ultimately resolved until shortly before the final M1 Abrams hull was completed. However, that's not the only lie I've caught the Army in, where the M1 Abrams is concerned. The legendary social commentator Paul Fussell famously stated, "What someone doesn't want you to publish is journalism, all else is publicity." The only era in which authentic journalism, rather than publicity, consistently scrutinized the M1 Abrams tank was during the early 1980s through the early 1990s. This was a bygone era in which writers and reporters actually lifted a finger to read the Pentagon's own published documents and compared what the generals and other top officials said to each other with what they said to the public. As opposed to today's standard of journalism, which is simply to copy-paste statements made by the Pentagon or the defense industry. It was within this era that a watchdog group called the Project on Military Procurement reported both heavily and honestly on the M1 Abrams, much to the frustration of the Pentagon. The Project on Military Procurement later merged with several other watchdog organizations concerned with government accountability to form the organization since known as the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. The relevance of that history is that one of POGO's first reports on Pentagon misconduct was a groundbreaking 1990 article on the M1 Abrams, titled, "The Army's M1 Tank, Has It Lived Up to Expectations?" This article is not only one of my primary sources on much of what went wrong with the M1 Abrams program, but it really stuck in the Army's craw because its sources were almost entirely Pentagon, government, and defense industry publications. In other words, it wasn't POGO's word against the Army's word, but the Army's word against the Army's word. For example, one of the most important, and yet most overlooked, paragraphs in this 1990 article was a quote from a US Army document titled FM-100-5 Operations. FM-100-5 isn't just any US Army publication. At that time, it was effectively the constitution of US Army policy during wartime, as it set the agenda from which all other Army warfighting policy stems. Along with an accompanying document, titled FM-100-1, The Army, this and FM-100-5 are considered the capstans of all Army manuals. The first edition of FM-100-5 was published in October 1939, and it went through more than a dozen iterations before it was superseded in 2001 by FM-30 Operations, but the edition introduced in May of 1986, which was current at the time POGO quoted it, was one of the most important of all of these documents, as this one introduced the doctrine of air-land battle. That said, the part of FM 105 that the Pogo article quoted was the following statement.
Today, it is estimated that one armor division equipped with M1 tanks will consume over 600,000 gallons of fuel per day, more than twice the consumption of Patton's entire army.
Pogo further notes that an armored division equipped with M1s has 348 of them, and that even though Patton's army had half the fuel consumption of a single M1 equipped armored division, they still ran out of fuel. However, while Pogo are often lambasted for tar brushing the M1 Abrams, they were in truth being overly generous considering what the complete body of that section in question reads, which will now be recounted here.
Sustaining large forces in combat has become an extraordinary challenge. Even in World War II, the challenge was considerable during its August 1944 pursuit across France. For example, the U.S. Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of gasoline every day. To fulfill this requirement and to meet similar demands from First Army, the Communication Zone organized the famous Red Ball Express, a conveyor belt of trucks connecting the Normandy depots with the field armies. At its peak, the Red Ball Express ran 6,000 trucks day and night in an operation that became more difficult with every mile the armies advanced. To meet the demands of logistics, 3 newly arrived infantry divisions were stripped of their trucks and left immobile in Normandy. The Red Ball Express itself consumed 300,000 gallons of precious gasoline every day, nearly as much as a field army. Today, it is estimated that one armor division equipped with M1 tanks will consume over 600,000 gallons of fuel per day, more than twice the consumption of Patton's entire army. The sole measurement of successful sustainment has always been the generation of combat power at the decisive time and place. As the environment for this has never been more demanding, today's units must be as simple and as rugged as possible. They must also use complex weapons and consume large stocks of material to fight a sophisticated enemy. High and mid-intensity operations will therefore be characterized by high consumption of military materiel, by a great diversity of equipment types, by the expansion of the battle area resulting from both sides employing sophisticated weapons, communications, and sensors, and by extended lines of support within and outside the theater of operation. Sustainment on this enlarged, material-intensive, electronically sensitive, and lethal battlefield presents an unprecedented challenge.
We've unprecedented challenge as, when the supply lines aren't perfect and uninterrupted, we are all screwed with our pants still on. As you've already seen with the supply situation that NATO got itself into in Afghanistan, it doesn't even take a peer nation-state adversary to wreak havoc on US supply lines when resupply from the sea or through a reliable regional ally isn't possible. That the US only deployed 16 M1A1s to Afghanistan was quite fortunate in hindsight, because had America's allies not done all the tank combat for us, a division-sized force of M1A1s would have more than doubled the already nearly unsustainable daily NATO fuel consumption during that war. But to get back on topic, recall that the iteration of FM 105 that Pogo cited in 1990 was published in 1986. In 1993, the US Army published a completely new iteration of FM 105, a mere 7 years after the previous one. If that isn't sketchy enough for you, the section that Pogo cited was scrubbed from the 1993 edition of FM 105, and it was replaced with the following language.
The logistics support for Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm demonstrates the impact of developing a theater plan for supporting deployed forces. The replacement operations management system processed and deployed 18,000 filler personnel. Of the 139,000 reserve personnel mobilized, 124,500 of them were in 1,033 units and 14,900 were from the individual ready reserve. While 40% of the Army CSS assets were deployed to the theater, 60% of those assets came from the reserve components. The modern division consumes as much as a World War II field army. During Operation Desert Shield, the defensive phase of the Gulf War, each division required 345,000 gallons of diesel fuel, 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel, 213,000 gallons of water, and 208 40-foot tractor trailers of other supplies each day. ranging from barrier material to ammunition. During Operation Desert Storm, a 100-hour offensive, a single division consumed 2.4 million gallons of fuel transported on 475 5,000-gallon tankers.
Gone from the new edition of FM 105 was any mention that a single division of M1 Abrams tanks consumed more fuel than Patton's entire army during World War II, and that the logistics required to sustain this force were stretched until they broke. It's obvious that the army was still smarting from Pogo's expose on the M1 Abrams. But then again, it still wasn't Pogo's word against the Army's word, but the Army's word against the Army's word. It's pretty obvious that a division-strength US Army formation in Desert Storm consuming that much fuel could only have been an armored division, and given how little fuel the Army's M60 Patton and Bradley fighting vehicles consume compared to the M1, this could only have been an armored division of some 350 M1A1s. More importantly, with that prediction in hindsight, note that a single US Army division consumed 2.4 million gallons of fuel over a span of only 100 hours. That's the same fuel consumption that the 1986 edition of FM 105 predicted, at 600,000 gallons per day, but it doesn't mention that some 2,000 M1A1s participated in the offensive. Given that 350 M1A1s consume 600,000 gallons of fuel every day, those 2,000 tanks consumed almost 3.5 million gallons per day, which is a horrifying 7 times as much fuel as all of the US forces and their allies consumed every single day in Afghanistan. And as if the Army's dumbing down of the narrative in the 1993 edition of FM 105 wasn't ignominious enough, the successor to that document scrubs the narrative entirely. FM 105 Operations was replaced in 2001 by FM 30 Operations, which no longer contains any mention whatsoever of Patton's army in World War II, the Red Ball Express, fuel consumption, Desert Storm, or even the M1 Abrams itself. In case you're wondering who signed off on this blatant cover-up, it was none other than Army Chief of Staff General Eric Shinseki, who by the way, also rigged the interim armored vehicle competition, so that only the General Dynamics Striker could win. Within a few months of his retirement from the army just 2 years later, Shinseki was promptly hired by Honeywell directly into their board of directors, where he made an annual 7-digit salary. And yes, this is the same Honeywell company which is the sole manufacturer and maintainer of the AGT 1500 gas turbine engine, which is also the only engine the US military will allow to be used in the M1 Abrams FOV. Honeywell didn't rub off well on Eric Shinseki, who was later appointed by President Obama to become his head of Veterans Affairs, only to resign in disgrace amidst a scandal he was responsible for. Shinseki didn't rub off too well on Honeywell either. That said, it isn't just the M1's fuel consumption the army is trying to hide. It also seems that they can't stand the heat. There has been a recent rash of comments on my presentations taking exception to my claim that the exhaust temperature of the AGT 1500 gas turbine engine is in excess of 1700 degrees, almost as if they are being coordinated. Another common thread between them is that a 1700 degree exhaust from the M1 Abrams is impossible because the highest turbine inlet temperature ever recorded was only 1600 degrees from a turbine recently developed by MHI. This reveals 2 failures of forethought on the part of wherever this argument came from. First, the exhaust from the AGT 1500 is 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, while the highest turbine inlet temperature was 1600 degrees Celsius. In other words, the MHI turbine had an inlet temperature of 2912 degrees Fahrenheit. The most astonishing failure of the detractors' arguments is that they cited the inlet temperature, given that it's obvious that the hottest temperatures from a gas turbine are from their exhaust manifolds, and not the air inlet on the beginning of the combustion cycle, which is at the opposite end of the engine. Most hilarious, however, is that none of them would admit they were wrong, no matter how many authoritative sources I cited. The detractors' narrative is in conflict with the US Army's own documentation, as the 1992 edition of Field Manual FM710, the Infantry Rifle Company noted that the temperature of the exhaust from the M1 Abrams is in excess of 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, and warns personnel against following closely lest they suffer serious burns. That this entire segment was still included in the 2000 edition of FM710 gives further credence to the M1's exhaust being 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, especially given that this statement remained uncorrected for more than 15 years. However, subsequent US Army field manuals have had this mission critical information dummied out of them. For example, the 2006 edition of FM710 put a gag on the temperature of the exhaust, and it now states the following.
M1 series tanks have an extremely hot exhaust plume that exits from the rear of the tank and angles downward. This exhaust is hot enough to burn skin and clothing.
No mention was made of just how hot the exhaust was, and the exhaust deflectors referenced in the 2006 edition had been standard equipment in all M1s since before the 1992 edition of FM710. The FM710 manual was superseded in 2017 by ATP 321.20, which not only fails to mention the M1's exhaust temperature, but also never even mentions the M1 Abrams at all. You heard that correctly. The Army's primary field manual for infantry operations makes no mention of the Army's primary weapons system, which consumes more of their maintenance budget annually than all other systems combined. As of summer 2022, the 2017 edition of ATP 321.20 is still current. Given that no retraction of the 1700 degree exhaust statement from the earlier FM710 editions was ever published, the Army is fully aware that it's true, and are trying to hide inconvenient facts from an entire generation of GIs. However, other articles corroborate the temperature figure given in Army field manuals, as they note how hot the engine itself can get in the field. A 1992 article titled Textron-Lycoming AGT 1500 Engine Transitioning for Future Applications, which was written by Textron engineer Richard Horan, has something to say on the matter of how hot the AGT 1500 runs. Specifically, it's noted that turbine blades, nozzles, and other fixtures inside an AGT 1500 operating at temperatures above 1500 degrees Fahrenheit are susceptible to soffidation, and when operating in a saline environment, hot corrosion will occur at temperatures in excess of 1750 degrees Fahrenheit. It's self-explanatory that, if the AGT 1500 didn't routinely operate at these temperatures, Textron wouldn't have these concerns. To give you an idea of just how hot a running AGT 1500 can get, its high-pressure turbine nozzle and rotor are stated in this article to be designed to withstand temperatures of up to 2180 degrees Fahrenheit. I will also remind you that Lycoming, the manufacturer of the AGT 1500 at that time, was a subsidiary of Textron. It also goes without saying that Textron isn't going to say anything even remotely negative about their product unless it's true. It's simply what defense companies do. It is also explicitly stated by Forecast International's 2009 report on the AGT 1500 that its turbine inlet temperature is approximately 2180 degrees Fahrenheit. Needless to say, if that's how hot the temperature at the beginning of the combustion cycle is, the AGT 1500's exhaust is quite a scorcher. To put the M1's 1700 degrees Fahrenheit exhaust into context, an iron poker heated to the point that it glows red hot only reaches a temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and I will have you know that I have personally been seriously burned on several occasions by metal that didn't even approach that temperature. Gas turbines aren't getting any cooler either. The US Department of Energy webpage on gas turbine technology states that a typical gas turbine's inlet temperature is up to 2300 degrees Fahrenheit, while newer examples are documented to exceed 2600 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, diesel tank engines never produce exhaust even approaching 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. For example, John Pike's global security website notes that the V8X1500 diesel V8 engine used in the Leclerc main battle tank has the same 1500 horsepower output as the M1's AGT1500, but also an exhaust temperature that never exceeds 400 degrees Fahrenheit. A gas turbine engine was at one time offered for the Leclerc, but it was turned down by the French army, undoubtedly due to their reluctance to force infantry taking cover behind their tanks to take a giant shrieking blowtorch to the face. Needless to say, this proves which side of the debate all the hot air is really coming from. However, a proper solution was in fact offered to the US Army. One story regarding the M1 Abrams tank's development which has received relatively little attention from the press is an ongoing effort by the manufacturer to re-engine the M1. General Dynamics Land Systems has been pressing since at least the 1990s to standardize a diesel engine for the M1, and they even bought a license to build one in the same power class as the Honeywell AGT1500 gas turbine. The GD883 engine is a US-made copy of the German MTU-883 KA501 engine that powers the Leopard 2 tank, and GDLS originally got the license to produce this engine for use in Israel's Merkava Mark IV tank. The MTU-883 was already proven in the M1 Abrams way back in the 1980s, but in April of 2000, GDLS showcased an M1A2 powered by the GD883 on the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The GD883 powered M1A2 demonstrated performance and mobility indistinguishable from the standard turbine-powered M1A2, save that it had an even longer range despite carrying half as much fuel. The US Army's reaction was essentially a yawn, and it was back to business as usual, despite only 12,000 AGT1500s ever being built for 10,500 M1s. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't even 8 years before those chickens came home to roost. Recall the revelations from the April 12, 2007 article "The Train Wreck Is Here Now" from part 1 of the 2022 M1 Abrams update. However, General Dynamics hasn't given up on the GD883 sales pitch. In 2013, Defense Media Network published an article titled "Abrams Dieselization Project, a Modest Proposal," which outlines the current effort. Like this very presentation you're watching right now, that article was split into two parts. The first of these mostly outlines the situation and uses excessive corporate doublespeak to pad for space, but it also mentions near the end of part 1 that compared to earlier iterations of the MTU-883, the GD883 runs significantly quieter and cleaner. However, the juicy details are in part 2 of this article. For instance, an Abrams Brigade Combat Team, or ABCT, contains 60 M1A2s or M1A1s, 60 Bradley fighting vehicles, and 112 M1 13 Gavin APCs, which costs a startling $66,735 just to move a single mile. However, merely switching from a turbine to a diesel reduces this cost from $66,735 to $57,636, a 14% reduction. A logistics package, or log pack, is required to replenish an ABCT every 12 hours, and a standard log pack for an ABCT includes 126 fuel trucks, 15 M969A1 5,000 gallon fuel tankers, and 48 M978 2,500 gallon fuel tankers, allowing for a range of only 205 miles for gas turbine powered M1s. According to the projections of General Dynamics, that fuel consumption is reduced by a whopping 50% with the GD883. Moreover, the US Army's Tank Automotive Research Development and Engineering Command, or TARDEC for short, examined those projections and confirmed they were true. The standard NBC system for the M1A2 Abrams requires bleed air from the AGT1500 to function, but General Dynamics successfully developed an alternate NBC system that requires no bleed air, further diminishing the case for a gas turbine engine. The elimination of dependency on a gas turbine engine to power the NBC system is also a watershed event for the M1 Abrams, as bleed air production by the AGT 1500 sharply reduces the engine's power output while the NBC system is running. However, the biggest bombshell of this article comes right at the end, when the General Dynamics Vice President notes that the AGT 1500's exhaust temperature is more than 300% hotter than that of the GD883. There is also a hint of desperation in the M1 dieselization effort, however, given how slow the M1 has been to sell on the international market, despite all the publicity ceaselessly crowing about it being an invulnerable superweapon. Iraq, Australia, Morocco, Poland, and Taiwan, for example, self-evidently bought M1 solely for the purpose of currying favor with Washington DC's interventionist factions. Ask the Iraqis how that turned out for them. During the same time frame, Leopard 2s, not M1s, were exported to Canada, Chile, Finland, and Singapore, countries whose governments aren't figurehead proxies of the Beltway. Their new tanks were chosen by them, not for them. Even Saudi Arabia, famously the first export customer of the M1A2 Abrams, attempted to abandon ship by negotiating with Germany in the 2010s for the possibility of buying Leopard 2A7s as an M1A2 replacement. I'll bet now they're really glad they were forced to stick with the M1A2. As almost half the problems with the M1 stem specifically from its use of a gas turbine engine, it's no surprise that GDLS has had a long publicity campaign to promote re-engineering this tank. After all, being a corporation, the logical goal for GDLS is to continue earning revenue, and it's hard to do that when your flagship product is silently judged by most of the world to be a leper. Though as of 2022, there are still no militaries discussing the possibility procuring of a diesel M1. In their zeal to justify the use of a gas turbine engine in their flagship products during the 1980s and 1990s, General Dynamics has become a victim of their own success. It goes without saying that the update on the M1 Abrams has been a long time coming, longer than even the 2021 update video on the Bradley. There are many other topics on the M1 that I could have covered here, even beyond everything already included, but this project has already dragged on for several times longer than I expected, and there was no point in making it any longer. In fact, there was actually a third iteration of the more M1 Abrams facts presentation that never ended up being completed, with a total of 100 more topics just on its own. That presentation may well end up being created after all, though some of the topics were already covered in the 2022 update. Not that I can't bring it back up to 100 new topics without much effort. The M1 Abrams is truly the gift that keeps on giving. So that said, let's end this presentation here before I have to make a part 3. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. If not, I won't be able to protect you from Mr. Mo, who can do the twist.